As we continue in our year of exploring the 7 principles of the Unitarian Universalist Association, we come today to principle number 5. We covenant to affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. I can't say I was looking forward to this one. It's the one people tend to forget when they're trying to think of all 7. I mean, think about the short phrases from the first 4. Inherent worth and dignity, justice, equity, and compassion, acceptance and encouragement, the search for truth and meaning. Those all make great bumper stickers. And then we come to the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. It just makes a lousy soundbite. Besides, I think many of us take the right of conscience and the democratic process very much for granted. We live in a country where we are fortunate enough to be able to do that, and it may seem unnecessary to include them in a short list of religious principles. Or we may consider them important, but not really within the purview of what belongs in a set of religious principles. I confess to having had some of both of those attitudes. I take them for granted, and, what are they doing in a religious statement? That is, until I began reading and working on this sermon. Because, as we will see, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process were not things our religious forebears took for granted, nor should we. And they were applied very intentionally to theological and religious life, even if today, when we hear those phrases, we tend to hear them more in terms of political and social action. They're relevant in both areas still for Unitarian Universalists. So this morning I want to begin with a little magical history tour, if you will. See who's old enough to catch the reference. As I share some of my discoveries, and I knew Bernie would get it. And then look at some of the contemporary implications of this principle. So I want to begin by sharing with you part of the organizing statement of a Unitarian congregation in New England that was adopted on May 3rd, 1863. Respecting in each other and in all the right of intellect and conscience to be free, and holding it to be the duty of everyone to keep mind and heart at all times open, to receive the truth and follow its guidance, we set up no theological condition of membership, and neither demand nor expect uniformity of doctrinal belief, asking only unity of purpose to seek and accept the right and true, and an honest aim and effort to make these the rule of life. Can I read that again? It's a little dense. Respecting in each other and in all the right of intellect and conscience to be free, and holding it to be the duty of everyone to keep mind and heart at all times open to receive the truth and follow its guidance, we set up no theological condition of membership, and neither demand nor expect uniformity of doctrinal belief, asking only unity of purpose to seek and accept the right and true, and an honest aim and effort to make these the very rule of life. Now, I want to point out several things about this statement. Note that in this statement, the right of intellect and conscience is specifically applied to the search for religious truth. So this is a theological stand that the Unitarians were taking in this congregation and in many, many congregations. They're making a specific point of saying that the individual intellect and conscience has more authority than the received teachings of the church or its traditions, and that therefore they have no theological conditions on membership. In other words, there's no creed that must be accepted. Each person has to keep their mind and heart open at all times to receive the truth and follow its guidance. Now let me just pause for a moment to make sure you realize just how remarkable this is. In most religious traditions, at least at that time, the authority to determine religious truth lay with the institution. The church was called upon to interpret and teach the truth with a capital T as revealed in Scripture and in tradition. Individual conscience was not considered a moral authority. But with us, even from the earliest days of Unitarianism, it was quite the other way around. As UU minister Earl Holt put it, it is this elevation of individual conscience to the primary category of religious authority that has been the uniquely distinguishing characteristic of liberal religious theology, from Channing's time to our own. Channing's very famous sermon was 1819 or 1821, I forget. So we're going way back. We believe that the individual conscience is the only legitimate source of religious authority, and that the purpose of the church is to grow and nurture individual conscience. There are no limits to the growth of this moral and religious force within us if we will nourish it faithfully, he said. Now, I have to argue just a little with Earl Holt. I don't agree with him that individual conscience is the only legitimate source of religious authority, nor do I think that has been the only perspective within our movement. We have always recognized that there is a certain amount of authority that comes to us from our tradition, from our teachings, from our history. So our conscience is not the only legitimate source of religious authority, but it does trump all the others. If my conscience contradicts the authority, I have to follow my conscience. As in this case, when I'm contradicting the authority, who is Earl Holt, who many of you may not know the name, but he's sort of one of the big boys of the Unitarian ministry that 20 years ago I would have felt very reluctant to contradict in public. But my conscience calls me to say that my conscience is not my only guide. So early on in our Unitarian history, the right of conscience had as much to do with religious belief as it had to do with any kind of social or political action. Their respect for every person to have freedom of both intellect and conscience was the very foundation of their insistence on freedom of religious belief. It was that freedom of conscience and intellect that led the early Unitarians to break away from the established churches in the early 1800s. Their conscience and their intellect told them that humanity had the potential for great good. And so they were drawn to reject the Calvinist doctrine of human depravity. Unitarians utterly rejected the notion that we are depraved beings, salvageable only by the grace of God. Their conscience and their intellect told them to respect new scientific knowledge, and so they insisted on the use of reason in interpreting religious teaching. And they believed that religious belief had to be in harmony with science, not in opposition to it. And that if new scientific advances challenged our religious beliefs, it was time to take a second look at our religious beliefs, because science was science, as opposed to belief. This commitment to the freedom of intellect and conscience for each individual then led the movement to a need for a system of governance within our congregations that would allow each individual to have a voice in the shaping of the community. And so the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process are together in this principle because they belong together, because they are mutually self-reinforcing. And both of them, of course, point right back to our first principle about the inherent worth and dignity of every person. It's because we believe that every person has inherent worth and dignity that we fight for their right to a free conscience. And it's because we believe that every person has inherent worth and dignity that we run our congregations in such a way as to give a voice and a vote to every person. But there's another reason why the right of conscience and the democratic process need to be in the same principle. I said that they're mutually reinforcing, and in some ways they are. But the democratic process means that the majority rules. That's what democracy is. And we know very painfully from our history that the majority is not always right. So guaranteeing the right of conscience, along with the democratic process, assures that dissenting voices will always be heard. The right of conscience leads to a faith in democracy, but it also provides a balance against the errors of democracy. As Thomas Jefferson said in his first inaugural address, all too will bear in mind this sacred principle, that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will, to be rightful, must be reasonable, that the minority possesses equal rights which equal laws must protect, and to violate which would be oppression. Now let's go back to that congregational organizing statement from 1863. Because after assuring that freedom of conscience and intellect meant that no theological unity would be required of members, it goes on to say, asking only unity of purpose, to seek and accept the right and true, and an honest aim and effort to make these, the right and true, the rule of life. So the church is not going to dictate what's right and true. Each individual is expected to discern that by following their conscience and intellect. But the church does ask of its members that they seek out what is right and true, that they embrace what is right and true, and that they make those things the very rule of life, which is a simple reminder of the fact that from our earliest days, Unitarians and Universalists have put a very strong emphasis on the importance of living out our faith. It's one thing to accept it and embrace it, and it's something else to put it into practice. And this gathering statement asks their congregants to do all of those things. And that leads me to the next facet of the right of conscience that I want to lift up for you and that will make up the rest of the sermon, because it's one thing to claim our right of conscience to affirm or reject a variety of religious beliefs. That's claiming freedom. We love to claim freedom. We're really good at claiming freedom. But with rights come responsibilities. And so, having been given this amazing freedom to follow their conscience, the early Unitarians also felt a profound responsibility to live accordingly, a responsibility that continues to be at the heart of our religious movement. I'm using the word movement a lot when I talk about Unitarianism or Unitarian Universalism. And the reason I do that, well, one reason, somebody quipped once many generations ago when asked where the Unitarians stand, he said, "They do not stand at all, they move." But also, technically we are not a denomination, although we use that word in casual conversation because it's the easiest way to describe ourselves. We are an association of independent congregations who choose to bond together in voluntary association as a movement. So we can refer to ourselves as a movement, as a faith tradition, as a religion. I tend to use movement because I like that implication of movement, because we're constantly growing and changing. Sometimes I will use denomination even though it's not technically correct, because it's what most people understand. Over the years, this conviction that we have to discern our truth with great seriousness and then act upon it has led members of our congregations, and at times the movement as a whole, to take some very difficult and unpopular stands. I want to lift up a few of them. But as I do, I'm also going to lift up the counter voice, because throughout our history, we have had profound differences of opinion among us on just about every issue we have ever addressed. I don't think that will come as a surprise to any of you who've been here more than once. Maybe any of you who are here for the first time but have read anything about us online. For example, we are very proud of our history in the abolitionist movement in this country, and rightfully so. I particularly love the story about the Unitarian minister Theodore Parker harboring escaped slaves in his home in Boston and keeping a loaded pistol on his desk as he wrote his sermons in case he was called to defend them. How can a story like that not give you the shivers? It's possible that that story is apocryphal. I hope it's true. There's no doubt from the historical records that Parker was an ardent abolitionist, that he did indeed harbor fugitive slaves, and that he took significant risks to support the abolitionist movement. He was listening to his conscience above law or public opinion, and his conscience told him that slavery was wrong. At the same time, we have to remember that while there were many Unitarians who were active in the abolitionist movement at that time, there were also many who were reluctant to disturb the status quo. The Unitarians tended across the boards to be a pretty comfortable bunch. Comfortable people don't always like to have their comfort disrupted. We have a strong history of speaking out against that kind of injustice, and we have a strong history of wanting to remain comfortable. It has created some pretty significant tension within our movement. The issue divided Unitarianism just as it divided the nation. We also have a long and powerful history of affirming the rights of women. And again, we should be rightfully proud of that history. Both Unitarians and Universalists ordained women far earlier than other denominations. Some of the greatest leaders of the women's movement, women like Susan B. Anthony and Margaret Fuller, were Unitarians. But we also have to remember that many of those early women ministers had trouble being taken seriously by the denomination when they sought pastorates. We have to remember that Samuel May Eliot, the president of the American Unitarian Association, voted no when suffrage came to a vote in Massachusetts. He was our president. He didn't want me to vote. Did he not follow his conscience, or did his conscience lead him somewhere different than Susan B. Anthony's conscience led her? We have a proud history in the civil rights movement as well. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called for clergy to come to Selma, the Board of Trustees of the Unitarian Universalist Association, who were in session in Boston at the time, adjourned their meeting and went to Selma en masse. Unitarian Universalists supported the civil rights movement in large numbers. But within our own denomination, we had a deep and painful rift over black empowerment, which would be the subject of a different sermon, but in the 60s, that has left scars to this day as we continue to struggle with how to heal the wounds of racism within our own denomination. The right of conscience is rarely easy, and it's never uncontroversial. And there have been other areas as well where our conscience has left the movement deeply divided. Opposition to the Vietnam War, especially in the form of draft counseling for conscientious objectors, which took place in many of our churches, split some of our congregations right down the middle and caused deep tension in many more. The issue of abortion, which is often considered sort of a liberal slam dunk because most of us are profoundly committed to a woman's right to choose, continues to lead people of strong UU convictions to different conclusions. We appear to be a very pro-choice denomination, but I have realized in recent years that we have people in our congregations who, because of their very powerful Unitarian Universalist values, find abortion unconscionable. But they tend to stay quiet about it rather than face the anger of their fellow members. Despite the tension it creates for us, our movement has often taken stands on issues like these. And I could quote you countless resolutions from countless General Assemblies expressing our commitment to countless causes. These resolutions come not from the top down, but from the bottom up. They begin with individuals who follow their conscience and choose to articulate their conclusions. And if enough others join them, the issue makes its way to the gathered body for a vote. That's a gross simplification of how the resolutions process works, but in a nutshell, it's close enough. They're definitely bottom up rather than top down. Whether or not an issue is officially adopted by the General Assembly, individuals are still free to commit themselves to speak up, to take action. Even if an issue is adopted by the General Assembly, individuals are still free to speak up and take action or issue on the other side of the issue. But when an issue is taken up by the larger body, it adds the power of collective speech and action to stand behind a commitment of conscience. Some of the most recent calls to conscience at the denominational level have been expressed through the Standing on the Side of Love campaign, which has two primary areas of emphasis. One of them focuses on gay, lesbian, bisexual, and or transgender rights, encouraging us to continue to fight for marriage equality for same-sex couples and for acceptance, understanding, and non-discrimination protection for transgender persons. The other branch of the Standing on the Side of Love campaign calls us to recognize immigration as a moral issue and to stand up against bigotry and injustice against immigrants. This issue is going to be the focus of our 2012 General Assembly in Phoenix, Arizona, this coming June. And I want to say just a little more about how that came to be. At General Assembly in 2010, the delegates were faced with a potentially divisive vote. The state of Arizona had recently enacted SB 1070, a piece of legislation that many of you have heard about, a law that required state law enforcement to determine the immigration status of people they stop if there is a reasonable suspicion that they are undocumented, and made it illegal to shelter, hire, or transport an undocumented immigrant. Some of the worst provisions of this law have since been blocked by a federal judge, and it's being challenged in the courts as we speak. The law raised widespread concern about racial profiling. What constitutes reasonable suspicion that someone is undocumented? The assumption was probably anybody with brown skin and a Mexican accent. As our UUA president, Peter Morales, pointed out, he could easily be stopped and detained in Phoenix under that law. The law also provoked horror that not just hiring undocumented immigrants, but even providing humanitarian assistance to them became illegal. A glass of water? A ride to a doctor? Imagine the Good Samaritan thrown in jail for helping that man by the side of the road. That's what the law required. As a result, many people of conscience were calling for a boycott and saying, we must not go to Phoenix. Lots of groups were boycotting Phoenix, not wanting to pump their money into a state that was enacting legislation that was so oppressive. And people didn't want General Assembly held in an environment that was going to be hostile and potentially unsafe for our members of color. So the Board of Trustees of the Unitarian Universalist Association, responding to these concerns, put a resolution on the agenda calling for such a boycott. But activists in Phoenix, local clergy, and immigrants' rights groups were asking us to come. They were saying, come and stand with us and help us make a statement. We want thousands of Unitarian Universalists here declaring how wrong this law is. Some people felt very powerfully that we needed to go and stand with our allies and let our voices be heard. We had a very divisive conversation about this at a ministers' meeting prior to General Assembly. I could see both sides of this issue. I didn't know how I was going to vote. I was waiting for the discussion in the plenary session, hoping to hear a compelling argument from one side or the other that would let me know what to do. My conscience was torn. My activist friends were saying, we must go. My colleagues of color were saying, you are saying to me that you are willing to put me at risk. And if we have General Assembly there, I can't go. Interest groups within the UUA were taking stands on one side or the other. Most of the groups involving minority populations in the UUA were saying, we can't do this, we can't go there, it's not safe. It's not fair to us to keep expecting us to walk into these hostile situations. People on the other side were saying, our colleagues and our friends and our allies need us. So I expected bitter, angry debate and a lot of bitter, angry people, whichever way it went, and I was not looking forward to the conversation. But to my surprise and pride, things took a completely different direction. Members who were passionate on both sides of the issue. Resolutions like this can't be argued or debated or amended on the floor. They can be debated whether to accept them or not, but they can't be amended on the floor of the General Assembly. They now have mini assemblies for that purpose, so that any amendments get made before the resolution is brought to the whole body, which has streamlined the process significantly. Hallelujah. People on both sides of this issue went to the mini assemblies with all of their passion, but with deep respect for the other side, and they talked and they talked and they hammered and they hammered, and they came up with a statement that they brought to the assembly saying, yes, we should go to Phoenix. We should not go to do business as usual. We should go to do an expressly focused Justice General Assembly that has us on the streets doing advocacy work with a minimum of business. partnering with local ally groups in every step of the way, directing as much of our money as possible to businesses that are immigrant-friendly, and with as many safeguards and provisions built in to protect our members of color as we can possibly do. And everybody signed on. It was not a unanimous vote. I don't think I've ever seen a unanimous vote at a General Assembly. But it was definitely enough of a majority to leave no one in question that the General Assembly had acted to do something very new and very different. And it was a beautiful example of what Tom Owen Toll said in our first reading. Naturally, human consciences do not operate in a vacuum. They need to be clarified by the loving critique of fellow truth seekers. We must decide for ourselves what to believe and do, but never solely by ourselves. It took our collective conscience, our collective vision, to lead us to the right action for General Assembly 2012. Now, I had originally intended this to be a sermon more specifically about immigration as a moral issue, but instead I found myself needing to put this whole concept of our right to conscience in a wider context. My hope is that the activist work we do at the General Assembly will allow me to come back better able to put these issues before you with ways that we could actually make a difference, not just to what happens in Arizona, but to what's happening right here in our own communities. I realize that immigration is one of those issues where strong adherence to our UU values may lead us to some different conclusions. I realize that illegal immigration is a problem and it has to be addressed. But the more I learn, the more I realize what a deeply complex problem it is, and that while many of our current practices towards undocumented persons may be legal, they are also profoundly inhumane. And so I close by repeating the words of our UUA president, Peter Morales, that I shared as one of our readings this morning. It is true that as citizens, we should respect the rule of law. More importantly, though, our duty is to create laws founded on our highest sense of justice, equity, and compassion. Loud voices urge us to choose fear, denial, reactionary nationalism, and racism. We must resist and choose the better way urged by every major religious tradition. We must choose the path of compassion and hope. We must choose a path that is founded on the recognition that we are connected, that we are all in this together. May it be so.